But I'm now delighted to move on to what we've all come to this meeting for, which is to hear Dr. Jessica Milner-Davis present on the subject of taking humour and laughter seriously, exploring the multidisciplinary field of humour studies. Jessica Milner-Davis is a fellow of the Society, a PhD, and she holds a research associate position at the University of Sydney and at the Brunel University London Centre for Comedy Studies Research. She's a life member of Clare Hall, Cambridge. She's given fellowships and lectures at many universities around the world, past president of the International Society for Humour Studies, and has received many awards. So welcome, Jessica. We need you, particularly during this lockdown, to inject some humour and comedy into our lives. Thank you.
In speaking to you tonight, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Gamaragal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's spirit, their imagination, and their rich history of storytelling and humour that is an inspiration to all Australians. You may well be asking, how on earth does someone come to be studying humour and laughter? Is this really a research field, or is it some kind of a joke? I've had to confront this kind of question ever since I embarked on my doctoral thesis back in the 1960s. My supervisor, Robert Quentin at the University of New South Wales, who was the founder of NIDA, but also the professor of drama, told me, "Oh, Jessica, don't study tragedy." That was my intended subject. "He studied comedy. You'll never be bored." Well, how right he was. I'm still fascinated by it. I chose to focus then on the rather despised variety of low comedy or farce. That's the kind that depends on physical and verbal humour rather than witty dialogue like you find in high comedy. Not many people thought this was important, and the typical reaction that I got when I said I was studying farce was, "Oh, that must be easy, what a joke." But from a practical and theatrical point of view, it was anything but. Quentin himself, a former director with the Old Vic Theatre Company, enjoyed producing comedy, and he thought it was far more demanding than tragedy, difficult to make it succeed, challenging for the actors, and even more difficult for me to analyse on a cold page. I began with the study of history and theatre of European farce across 9 different cultures. I was mostly working in translation. And from there I progressed to teaching comedy at Stanford University as a visiting scholar in the 1970s. Here I was lucky enough to work with very famous names in English and theatre studies, but also with researchers in psychiatry and human biology. I joined a research group that was looking at aggression in humans and animals. And I did this because what perplexed me most about farce was then, and still is, how does it manage to combine being the funniest, laugh out loud kind of comedy with being the most physically violent? Well, just think about Buster Keaton or Roadrunner cartoons. And yet it's universally regarded as harmless. Political history and theatre history both show that it is not farce but satire that falls foul of the censor. So I wondered, how does farce escape that kind of fate? I have some ideas now, but still not all the answers. And then in 1976, in San Francisco, I heard that the British Psychological Society was holding a conference. And this was a world first. It was a conference on humour and laughter in Cardiff, Wales. And here's the conference poster. Off I set to attend. And yes, in case you were wondering, there was a paper on whether the Welsh have a sense of humour. And sadly, it concluded, no, they do not, but they do have a great sense of fun. Nowadays, psychologists such as my colleagues Willibald Ruch at the University of Zurich and Rod Martin at Western Ontario have developed a carefully defined set of personality traits that associate with different senses and habits of using humour and having a sense of humour. Back then, in 1976, it was all a bit speculative. But the conference attracted media attention. Time magazine covered it, and so did the International Herald Tribune. And I'll show you a clipping. Yes, well, they both treated it with a combination of levity and fascination, as you can see, and especially picked on the photo of a couple of unfortunate American delegates who were snoring off at the table. The conference effectively founded the field of humour and laughter studies, despite being very bizarre. It was strongly influenced first by psychology and subsequently by linguistics, when the International Society for Humour Studies was formed, and the linguists launched a highly respectable journal with Mouton de Gruyter in Berlin, still exists and is well regarded. It's called Humour, the International Journal of Humour Research. I am a long-standing member of the editorial board, and editors have included a sociologist, a psychologist, and a computational linguist. So you can see it strives for transdisciplinarity, or at least multidisciplinarity in its range. And in 1997, back here in Australia, I founded the Australasian Humour Studies Network to foster exactly such interdisciplinary dialogue in the Antipodes. We started at UNSW with a small seminar of 7 scholars. They came from theatre studies, medicine, management, political science, psychology, and social work. And this network is now about to hold its 28th annual conference in February next year. I expect we will have, as usual, 30 or more presentations from perhaps 10 different academic disciplines, plus some real-life practitioners. Certainly, we'll have my favourite Tasmanian cartoonist, John Kudelka. In 2006, John won my heart with this clever tribute to the importance of comedy and laughter. Not cogito ergo sum, but I take the piss, therefore I am. Well, I'll come back to discuss research on piss-taking and its significance to the Australian national identity. But right now, I better focus on the main subject, which is how central to human nature is the experience of responding to humour. John acknowledges it in his clever parody, but what else can we say about it? From the time of Aristotle and Plato, philosophers have speculated about humour and laughter. Many have seen laughter and its associated playfulness as an essential part of human nature, so that not just errare est humanum, but ridere est humanum. On Parts of Animals, Aristotle claimed that laughter was indeed the property of mankind alone. And this is an idea that was still firmly taught in Shakespeare's time. But we now know that play, accompanied by laughter or something acoustically similar, is actually found in animals such as chimpanzees and even in rats. Rats have a squeak laugh when they play together, and chimps a pant laugh. In 2009 and 2010, Davila Ross and her colleagues studied the acoustics of tickle-induced vocalizations in human infants and also in juvenile great apes. She was trying to reconstruct the likely sequence of human laughter's phylogenetic emergence. And if I show you a chart of her findings, you will see that that primordial tickle-induced vocalizations date back some 10 to 16 million years ago to the last common ancestor of humans and great apes. But that true laughter, laughter-like vocalizations leading to modern humor, with its extraordinary range of vocalizations, whoops and cries and associated behaviors such as tears and hiccups and falling around because your legs are too weak from laughing and so on, only emerges after the separation of the hominin line from the chimpanzees. This is because it depends, laughter, on the adaptation of the larynx, the development of speech, and probably on the self-awareness that we now term theory of mind. Nevertheless, evolutionary scientists seem to agree that these early primordial forms of proto-laughter were a shared pleasurable kind of wordless chorusing that did serve to reduce stress and promote bonding in the same way as laughter does today. Darwin himself, in The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals in 1872, noted that laughter gives pleasure and that in both humans and apes, it's related to social relationships. He didn't remark, however, on the contagiousness of laughter, although children and even adults in a silly mood indulge in spontaneous outbreaks of glee sparked off by each other. Just hearing laughter stimulates others to laugh, which is why TV and films use laughter soundtracks, canned laughter. And this aspect underlines laughter's modern role in promoting social bonding. In studying laughter, a key distinction is one that is made between the Duchenne smile and laughter and non-Duchenne smiling and laughter. The first is a true smile that engages the muscles that lift the corner of your mouth and those that lift your cheeks and crinkle the corners of your eyes. So if I show you now some differences, some photos, you'll be able to spot the differences. From Van Deventer and Patterson, these three photographs come. On the left, you have a deadly serious face. Well, not too deadly. In the middle, you have a non-Duchenne smile. And on the right, you have the true Duchenne smile, lifted mouth and lifted eyes. And I'll just, for contrast, show you a simpler model with, on the left, the Duchenne, and on the right, the non-Duchenne. These smiles are named after the 19th century French neurologist Guillaume Duchenne, and the true smile is the feel-good factor of experiencing humor. That's what it indicates. It can be a response to either spontaneous play or to a stimulus that elicits laughter, such as tickling or decoding a humorous remark. The evolutionary biologist Gervais and Wilson in 2005 theorized that the non-Duchenne smile, which can appear quite cold and threatening, is a later development. It adapts true smiling to a contrary social purpose, such as politeness, pretense, even menace. Like in the scary film character, the Joker, we certainly know it when we see it. And here is the Joker. The difference is real, and the difference complicates the study of humor and laughter. But turning to the nexus between laughter and humor, it's not a simple relationship. If humor is the stimulus, then smiling and laughter are only part of a wide range of possible responses, and they're often deliberately withheld, or they may be substituted with a groan or a protest. Oh God, not that one again. In fact, a deeper insight into what it means to experience humor had to await the development of cognitive science with its investigative tools for seeing how the brain's neural nets respond. This kind of research has definitively put aside one long-standing but simplistic approach to humor, that the experience is purely cognitive, and one either gets the joke or one doesn't. This is a view that was strongly held by many linguists. They argued that the vital ingredient in humor is not its playfulness, as was advocated by the anthropologists and the folklorists, but its logical mechanisms for playing with things. Things like Grice's maxim, which posits that we rely on a speaker meaning exactly what they say so that we can have conversation and respond. Well, in humor, you don't always mean what you say. For a couple of decades, the semantic script-based theory of humor, or the SSTH, developed by Attardo and Raskin, ruled humor studies and also the journal. The SSTH posits that humor is created when an incongruous combination of two or more opposed scripts or meanings is resolved by a punchline revealing the hidden meaning. So let me give you an example. Here's a joke. there are only 10 different types of people in the world. There are those that read binary and those that don't. So the first line leads you to expect a list of 10 psychological or other types, but as we go through, we receive 2, not 10. This is an incongruous match. Until the mind steps backwards and reinterprets the key figure of 10 as 1 followed by 0, binary coding. Certainly, the principles of script opposition and the logical mechanism for decoding this work coming from the SSTH work very well for dissecting this joke. But there is still some ambiguity, is there not? What's the joke about? What's it targeting? Is it just a clever play? Is the target someone like me who didn't get the joke the first time round and had to think about it very carefully? Or is the target our numerate colleagues who despise the innumerate, the intolerant? Or perhaps it's both. Whatever, there is certainly a kind of hidden animus behind the verbal or beneath the verbal construct that remains somewhat mysterious. Jokes like this have been called the fruit flies of humour research, and the SSTH analysis works well for many of them. But to sociologists and literary and cultural historians, the theory has always failed to take account of the more emotive aspects of humour. Humour always transgresses some rule or another, whether that's the rule of logic or one of propriety. And to do this, it depends on what my colleague Wally Chafe at UC Santa Barbara has termed the importance of not being earnest, what in literary studies we call the play frame. Clearly, there is more than just cognition going on. A breakthrough came from a 2001 fMRI study by Vinod Goel of York University in Toronto and a colleague. This demonstrated that for their subjects experiencing humour, both affective and cognitive neural networks play a part. Their findings were extensively replicated, and not surprisingly, a host of complex brain processing actions have been uncovered. The mesolimbic reward pathway is strongly implicated, and there are marked differences in responding to verbal and visual humour, and also to different types of humour, benign or aggressive, and also between genders. Another key fMRI study was reported by Moran and his colleagues in 2004. This one showed that there are distinct stages also to the processing of humour. The first is detecting it, that is, understanding that the stimulus presented is to be classed or treated as humorous. And that stage of processing is predominantly cognitive, but has some affective elements. The second or longer stage, following after a millisecond or so, engages more affective pathways, and this is the successful comprehension and appreciation of the humour. Let me show you, although I should reiterate, this is not my field of expertise, but it's something those of us who study humour have to get our minds around, but I'll show you the charts from their 2004 study. So here is the first slide. They were using clips from Seinfeld and from The Simpsons, American material. The important difference between the two stimuli was that the first has canned laughter and the second one has live recorded laughter. And you see the different pathways lighting up in the two hemispheres of the brain, first for detection and second appreciation. And looking at that over a time lapse, if I can quickly pass on, you see here a sequence in which there are several episodes of humour detection followed by humour appreciation. So the red band following by the longer stage 2, and then a lapse of processing, and then another joke or funny happening in the video or film is detected, and then another longer pause of watching and being entertained, and then yet a third one. And their key takeaways, if you like, are that the brain activity is time-locked with increases in the left inferior frontal and the posterior temporal cortices first, then time-locked in appreciation with action in the regions of the insular cortex and the amygdala. And these findings are evidence that humor depends critically on both kinds of neural systems, those cognitive ones for detecting and resolving incongruities, and those for the expression of affective appreciation of humor. So following these insights in studying the creation and the reception of humor, we now distinguish as scholars between a number of stages: humor production or creation, humor detection, humor comprehension, humor appreciation, and finally, a range of humor responses that can include humor support, simply the positive response to other people who choose to use humor. And this is sometimes called humor competence. As a research term, humor itself has come to have a very broad umbrella meaning. It embraces all the phenomena relating to the field, so laughter, smiling, amusement, jokes and joke-telling, comic stimuli, such as cartoons, stage and film comedies and novels, varieties of humor such as satire, farce, parody, caricature, and so on, and humor as therapy or an educational tool. Humor in advertising for money-making, humor for political campaigning, the list goes on and on. Humor in religion is an important area too. The word humor can also refer, however, in a narrower sense, to a very particular worldview in which one smiles with amusement at the adversities and the imperfections that life throws in one's way. In French culture, this kind of humor is seen as something quintessentially English. It's l'humour anglaise, as opposed to the more witty, cerebral esprit français. In Anglo-Saxon cultures, this civilizing tradition of laughing at yourself and valuing detachment and the ability that valuing detachment is described as having a good sense of humor. And from the beginnings of personality testing at Harvard University in the 1930s, Gordon Allport included such a sense of humor as a correlate with maturity and good mental health. Sense of humor features highly, if informally, in such things as criteria for dating and marriage. And as I and one of my colleagues at Flinders University, Sharon Roach-Agnew, reported in our recent book on judges and humor, a national survey of the Australian judiciary, a very serious group, found that more than half of them considered having a sense of humor as essential or very important in their everyday work. So humor and sense and humor embrace gentler and benevolent aspects, as well as negative and aggressive comic forms and styles, things like irony, sarcasm, and biting wit. Both forms can be enjoyable, but humor can also be damaging. It can bind us together, but it can also divide and demean. In the West and in the East, this kind of disparagement humor has traditionally been frowned on by Aristotelians, by Christian, and by Confucian thinkers. Aristotle's eutropelia, or the benign and well-balanced use of humor, was considered the mark of an admirable person long before the 18th century, when the very well-bred Lord Chesterfield, in his letters to his son, decried the uncouth behavior of those who indulge in uncontrolled and boisterous laughter. And here is what Lord Chesterfield had to say, writing from Bath to his son: "I must particularly warn you against it. How low and becoming a thing is laughter, not to mention the disagreeable noise that it makes and the shocking distortion of the face that it occasions." Negative reactions to humor extend beyond politicians who sue for comedians for defamation damages, even beyond those who are targets of racial jokes, of which there is plenty in Australian folklore, I'm afraid to say. Research has shown that around the world and across more than 28 languages and culture groups, there is a small minority of quite normal people who positively dislike laughter, and not like Chesterfield because it is unmannerly, but because they find it positively alarming. Such people were first identified by the Swiss psychologist Michael Titze back in the 70s, and research has been carried further by Ruch and his team. Their condition is termed gelatophobia, or the fear of being laughed at. No, it's not about ice cream, it's about laughter. Gelatophobia is now recognized as part of a triad of personality differences that relate to humor called the phoficat, dispositions towards ridicule and laughter, or the phoficat, because there are three of them. The first, pho, is fearing being laughed at. The second, phil, is enjoying being laughed at. And the third, cat, catagelasticism, is enjoying laughing at others. These are inter-individual difference variables. They're found in normal populations, but the first of them, in extreme forms, can be clinically relevant. Gelatophobes fear being ridiculed. They fear appearing ridiculous to other people. They have a paranoid sensitivity towards others' laughter. They misinterpret normal humor and laughter as being weapons, and they show negative emotional responses to laughter and react by avoiding situations where being laughed at could happen. And importantly, the gelatophobes' interpretation of humor and laughter is independent of the intention towards them. That is, whether the humor is harmless or aggressive. It means that they misinterpret most instances as being malevolent. How this affects people over their whole lifespan is now a serious subject of research. More generally, psychological studies by both Ruch and Martin, among others, have shown that a positive appreciation of humor can be regarded both as an innate personality trait and as a settled habit of ways of using humor as a coping behavior in life. And some of these habits, or humor styles, for a literary person, this is really quite annoying, the psychologist poaching the term humor style, but never mind, we live with it. These humor styles, some of them, are more virtuous and positive than others, and they're probably linked to better health, mental and physical health outcomes. But as Rod Martin has noted, conclusions from experimental research, including some cross-cultural comparisons, for example, between Taiwan and Canada, do remain tentative, and it's unrealistic to be too simplistic about the relationship. We can summarize in Martin's words that some types of humor and behavior are beneficial to some aspects, some are neutral, some are even detrimental, some are beneficial and detrimental, and importantly, there are different mechanisms involved in different effects. It's a complex field. Nevertheless, when carefully used, humor is indeed valuable for stress reduction in settings such as hospitals, nursing homes, emergency services, and so on. This is now widely recognized, and there are many specialist training programs that have been developed, both in Australia and New Zealand and overseas. For example, in Australia, there is the Clown Doctors program, which is run by the Humour Foundation and has clinical results that are being studied by UNSW's Belinda Goodenough and others. While humour does not always result in laughter, and may indeed, as we have seen, provoke displeasure for various reasons, neither does laughter always result from humour. For example, laughter is ubiquitous in casual conversations between friends. Ask any linguist who is coding a natural discussion. It often arises for no obvious reason, and it can accompany an entirely innocent remark such as, "Okay, well, I'll be off then." Evidently, we're dealing with a highly complex phenomenon. But then what about cultural differences? Don't they come into play? Well, yes. Working with scholars in other languages and cultures, as I have, it doesn't take long to realize that it's not in fact what we laugh at, nor even how we laugh, that varies, but it is when, where, and with whom we indulge in laughter. That is, it's not laughter itself, but it's the cultural conventions that govern its use that vary greatly from one society to another. So rather than talking about Australian humour, one can talk about Australian uses of humour. or the ways in which Australians use humour. I mentioned earlier the Australian predilection for using straight-faced piss-taking. We're now allowed to say that. When I first began studying this, we had to call it Mickey-taking. This is a kind of hazing of friends and newcomers that forms part of a spectrum that is technically known among comedy theorists as deadpan irony. To illustrate it, I'll quote from a real-life example. This happened to the American fantasy writer Jack Deane, who used to, maybe still is, living in Australia. When he was interviewed for the Australian Weekend magazine in 2017, he recounted how he had been living here quite happily for several years, considered himself at home, got on well with Aussie's friends, but he was driving out back and found himself quite bemused by what happened at a petrol station. This is clearly pre-COVID if he was driving out back freely. He asked for directions to the toilet. "Ah," replied the laconic serviceman. "Yeah, you'll need a compass and a cut lunch for that one." Well, perhaps even an Australianised American does need to be told that cut lunch means sandwiches, but otherwise, what could have puzzled him? The statement is quite clear. It indicates that 1, the place is hard to find. 2, it requires effort equivalent to an all-day wilderness trek with a compass and food. Hence, you have to deduce that the toilets are hard to find and a long way off. But are they? Is it not equally possible, perhaps even more likely, that the piss was being taken? The statement is indeed an ironic indication. Look behind you, Jack. The facilities are only a step or two obvious to everybody except you. Having been subjected to this kind of teasing and deadpan leg pulling since arriving as a young schoolgirl from England in the 1950s, I was really not aware of it, or not aware quite how typically Australian it is, until I embarked on a collaboration with colleagues from the Japan Society for Humour and Laughter Studies. This resulted in our 2007 book, Understanding Humour in Japan. I'm no scholar of Japanese, just as I'm not of brain research. So I had to learn from scratch about the various forms and conventions of humour and comedy practiced and enjoyed in Japan. And as I did so, I began to realise how entirely different they were from the more familiar culture of Australia. The former editor of the humour journal, sociologist Giselinde Kiepers, who was then at the University of Amsterdam, had the same experience as I did when she undertook a study of joking taste cultures in her home country, the Netherlands. And she reported, quote, "It wasn't until I did a similar project in the US that I realized that there was something particularly Dutch about Dutch respondents, despite their great differences," unquote. Because one is so enmeshed in one's own culture, one is normally unaware of its conventions. One simply does not see the rules. One is too busy carrying them out to be conscious of what they are. So only after working with my colleagues in Japan was I able to begin writing anything meaningful about Australian humour. I had managed to acculturate all right, but only later did I realise how I had been acculturated. You know, if I had had to sit the Australian citizenship test, I would probably have failed it. As Kudelka remarks about an immigrant couple in the following cartoon. They've just come out from their exam. Well, Australia has a most extraordinarily permissive tradition of humour use. I concluded from working with my Japanese colleagues, and now also reinforced by collaborating with others in South Korea, Indonesia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the PRC, that Japan and Australia are probably at extreme opposites of the scale of social regulation of humour and laughter. I'm not talking about legal legal matters, but I'm talking about social conventions. Laughter is considered important in Japan, and its modern culture even continues to include some obligatory practices like ritual laughter on specified annual occasions. There are 8 such surviving rituals in Japan, and they are meticulously attended to in different locations at different times of each year. There are parallels, like the Feast of Fools that used to exist in medieval European cultures, but for us now, what remains are pale shadows in the form of Mardi Gras and school muck-up days, certainly not obligatory. But despite this respect for laughter in Japan, in everyday life, containment strategies have traditionally been internalized. There are hierarchical rules about personal distance. There are considerations of face and shame controlling the use of humor. And traditionally, women and warriors have been persons who should not be seen smiling in public. An old saying holds that for a samurai, one dimple in one cheek once a year is quite enough. Things are changing, but still, my colleague, Mr. Shokichi Oda, wrote back in 2008 that in Japan, it has long been considered a virtue amongst upper-class men to refrain from laughing. In general, women have traditionally tried to laugh with their mouths only slightly open and to cover their mouths with one hand when laughing. He felt constrained to coin a term to describe when and where it is socially permissible to laugh in Japan. These times and places for laughter he called warai no ba, laughter containers. By contrast, in Australia, we have no need of such a term. There is no such constraint. We have always been able to joke with anyone, not just our friends, but even our Prime Minister if we were to meet him. We regard it as our social obligation to take the piss. We dish it out to friends and to strangers, just like the serviceman did to Jack Dan. We do the same to newcomers and even to tourists. One of my colleagues studies the use of humour in tourism and how to do training programs so that tourists are not severely embarrassed. It's Australia. We're allowed to. In her 2003 book, Dancing with Strangers, the distinguished Australian historian Inga Clendinnen ventured her opinion that our Australian jocularity perhaps has something in common with that found in Indigenous traditions. And over the years, I have learned a great deal from supporting the few Indigenous students who have been able to devote some study time to this issue. 2 in particular, Lillian Holt in Adelaide and Angelina Ulila Hurley in Brisbane, are adamant that for their people, humour is inextricably bound up with the question of survival and overcoming odds, both now and in the past. And this is borne out by writers like the proud Bunjalung woman, the late Ruby Guinea Lawford, in her autobiographical novel, Don't Take Your Love to Town, published in 1988. Speaking of the liberating role of humour in her own life, she records how she used it against unwanted official visitors at the hospital bedside of one of her adopted sons, Nobby. He was ill with hepatitis. After his release from jail, you'll be glad to know that he did eventually recover. And here is how she describes the scene. The police were always checking Nobby out. They wouldn't leave him alone. Not believing he was sick, they pushed past me. I didn't say anything till all 4 of them were in the bedroom. And then I said, I hope you've had your shots. He's got contagious hepatitis. You should have seen those dicks fly out of the room, asking where the nearest doctor's surgery was. I fell about laughing, and so did Nobby. It was very carefully prepared, effective retaliation. It was also good therapy for the patient. It's now becoming possible for us to discern a long tradition of joking being played defensively by our First Nations against their dispossessors. Examining the records of the first cultural exchanges that are described in the diary of Lieutenant Watkins Tench, so back in 1788, Inge Clendenin describes how the two guides, Colby and Boulardere, who were accompanying one of Captain Phillips' exploration parties, performed a dance for the group by the common campfire, and they took special delight, she says, in miming the more spectacular British slips and stumbles of the day with inimitable drollery, in Tench's words. They were effectively taking the piss out of the hapless newcomers who didn't have a clue in the bush. This is the positive side of humour, and it is one that has been cheerfully adopted in Australia over the last 40 years by what we can now see are two generations of the so-called ethnic stand-ups. They were pioneered by Italian and Greek artists in TV and film programs like the well-remembered Comedy Company and Wogs Out of Work. They were brave souls who set out, as one of them put it, and I quote, to emphasize the ugliness of a lot of old migrants towards new migrants, to show that they were dealing out the same intolerant attitude to new arrivals that they themselves had experienced when they first arrived. Unquote. These are the words of Australia's first Vietnamese Australian stand-up, the lanky, dreadlocked young man, well, now middle-aged man called Hung Lee. Lee described his experience of audience reaction to his participation in the show Wogs Out of Work as follows. People would come to the theatre in packs and they would keenly wait to hear the piss being taken out of their nationality. And after the show, people would complain if their country hadn't received equal piss take time. And when packs of boys in Monaros, remember them, roared past me in the street yelling abuse, they meant it as a sign of affection and appreciation. 2 years, 500 shows. Hey, Ching Chong meant love your work, China. How bizarre. The Yellow Peril from Sin City, i.e. Saigon, is Hung Lee's memoir of his time in that show. There were other pioneers, of course. They included Ernie Dingo, and more recently, a whole string of winners of the Comedy Deadly Awards, such as Leon Filewood. Here he is, Leon, winner of the 2018 Deadly Funny Finals at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. For voices that are marginalised in society, using humour gives some freedom of expression and assertion of identity. And across the world, it is much prized, therefore, in times of struggle. Humorists and cartoonists often suffer for their art, but they persist because it's important to them and it's important to their audiences. Here in Australia, despite our deep-seated separations, perhaps humour can now serve to unite us rather than divide. And Clendenin suggested this, saying, through processes that I do not understand, we, the Australians and the Indigenous, are now more like each other than we're like any other people. We even share something of the same style of humour, which is a subtle but far-reaching affinity. Here, in this place, I think we are all Australians now. I hope so. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I have a few questions from the audience, so welcome everybody. My name's Elizabeth Deane, and as Susan introduced me before, I'm the Secretary of the Events Committee, and I'm going to forward your questions on to Jessica and hopefully add a few of my own if I get the opportunity. So thank you very much, Jessica. That was extremely interesting, and I've got quite a few interesting questions here that I hope you can enlighten us on. The first that I'd like to pass to you is how do we know that primordial laughter or vocalizations were tickle-induced?
Well, without asking you to read the whole article. The short answer to that is it's by behavioral analogy with modern chimp behavior, and adding into that the reconstruction of the larynx and the vocal capabilities of particular ancient fossilized remains. So it's the recreation of what are thought to be the primordial apes.
Can I just ask a non-ape question? Is there anything that you would have in other, trees of animals that actually would you call something like laughter? And I'm not picking the obvious one like kookaburra, but in fact, some vocalizations that are akin to this sort of interaction.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. What do you call laughter?
Yes.
And the definition is acoustic. It's a pattern of breathing and interrupted breathing, accompanied by vocalizations. But that isn't the same thing as true laughter, because true laughter has all kinds of a range of sounds, and it's accompanied by emotion. So that was the distinction that Gervais Wilson was making in his article.
So laughter is defined by different types of vocalizations. Is that's the essence of it?
You can say a laughter-like vocalization, which is what the term that's used, distinct from true laughter. And I think the distinction that I showed between the Duchenne smiles, this is also found in laughter. You can see the expression on the face in true laughter, whereas you can make the vocalizations, and kookaburras do, they mimic the sound of laughter, but they don't change their faces, not the same way as humans do. There's no eye crinkling that I can, none that I can
Don't go ever got close enough to a kookaburra.
not in our local lot of kookaburras who call at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you. Okay, you've talked about different ethnic communities and concepts of humour, but I wonder, are there any transnational types of humour associated with particular groups, such as with older women?
Well, it comes down, the short answer is yes, but it then comes down to the question of what do we mean by types of humour, and types of laughter too, but types of humour, types of jokes. There are topics which are held in common by similar categories of people around the world. So if you mentioned older women, for example, yes, absolutely. We do tend to laugh at the same kinds of things. There's a huge body of seniors jokes, some of which appeal to men and some of which appeal more to women, some of which appeal to both. But it's not a type of humor, it's a topic for humor. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so, yes.
But if you can strike on the right topic, and then you are confronting two people from different cultures who share an interest in the topic together, then laughing at that topic, a piece of humor or a joke which concerns that particular target, is an incredibly bonding and unifying thing to do.
Thank you. Now, one other question that actually relates to that is Schadenfreude, I'm going to say that wrong, I'm sure, common across many cultures.
I'm so sorry, I didn't get that.
That's probably because my pronunciation
No.
bad. Is that laughing at the bad things happening to other people common across many cultures?
Oh yeah, unfortunately you'll find that, I think, universally. But then it comes down to a matter of personal taste.
Yep.
Everybody develops what's called a taste culture in humor. So this is following the concept of Bourdieu's aesthetic tastes. And this, I mentioned the research work that's been done by my colleague Giselinde Keepers at the University of Amsterdam. This really was the field that she pioneered. She was in Holland, she is Dutch, she studied Dutch tastes in humor. The Dutch pride themselves on being what they consider a totally classless society. And she found that it wasn't true. When it came to what kinds of humor people enjoyed, what topics they liked laughing at, whether it was stand-up, whether it was joke exchanging sessions, whether there were particular TV series that they liked that were sitcoms and so forth. There was highbrow, lowbrow, and middlebrow, just as Bourdieu had predicted. It's not just about art, it's also about humour.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the audience. What is the status of the ideas of Arthur Koestler and his book Active Creation?
Yeah, Koestler was a very interesting pioneer, and he doesn't get the attention that he deserves. So if somebody's interested in the act of creation, then please pursue that, because somebody should. Koestler's idea was that there were two parallel ideas, and they're bouncing along separately as you tell a joke or you're introducing a topic with humor, and then snap, there's a connection. And the parallel lines should not connect, but they do. And he regarded this as the kind of eureka moment or the light bulb moment, in the same way that scientific discovery and artistic creation takes place. I think this is a very interesting and valid analogy. In terms of humor theory, it doesn't add anything very much to the idea of two opposed scripts or two opposed concepts which are presented, and a punchline which suddenly reinterprets them as joining rather than being separate. So I think this is why Koestler doesn't get the recognition that he should.
Right. Thank you. Can you comment on humour and racism?
Oh, yes. Now, and this is a very important topic for Australia, a really, really serious topic. So I said that really, I don't think there is anything particularly Australian about the kinds of things that we laugh at, that it's more the way in which we laugh, or rather the times, places, and the lack of any rules about what we can laugh. This is one reason why you find, or the joke law people who collect bodies of joke law and study them, that such a huge amount of racist joking in Australia. And I'm just looking here for a quote, because I would have loved to have fitted this into the lecture. So thank you very much, whoever asked the question. It is a huge problem. There are multi-volumes, penguin collections of Australian jokes. You may know them, collected by Philip Adams and Patrice Newell. And they reported that they found a vast amount of, I quote, savage, uncivilized jokes about Aborigines, Jews, migrants, jokes that are bigoted, blasphemous, phobic. They outnumbered all other categories in the Australian collection. This isn't anything particularly unusual, because other cultures would have the same thing, but it is of concern. There is, however, one group which they don't seem to have focused on in there, perhaps because they were going into publication. But my late colleague Christy Davies from the University of Reading, who was a world authority on joke law, identified that we do have one unique collection of jokes not found anywhere else in the world in Australia. Do you want to know what it is?
Yes.
Vomit jokes.
I thought it'd be poo jokes. The kids like the poo jokes.
And kids all around the world love poo jokes. There's nothing unique about that, but vomit jokes, yes.
Yes, really.
Isn't that a great thing to take cultural pride in?
Well, for something completely different now, you talked about humour and health, and you talked about clown doctors. So I would you like to expand on the role of humour and well-being?
Yes, there's a very specific question which has been explored experimentally, and it's about whether humour helps cope with physical pain. So I might deal with that first. And my colleague at the University of Zurich, Jenny Hoffman, and others in a 2019 review did find support that for the idea that humorous distractions, such as watching a comedy clip and so on, does increase tolerance for pain. On the other hand, non-humorous distraction can also help. So their main finding, typical research finding, was methodologies need to be improved before we can be sure about this. But the question of stress reduction, of coping, of using humor to cope, not necessarily with physical pain, but just with general stress, has been better studied. And there are a lot of personal testimonies too, such as those by concentration camp survivors in the Holocaust, or Changi in World War II, that certainly support the idea that humour aids resilience even under very dire conditions. There are some physiological effects of laughter which relate here, and these are very well established experimentally. Laughter activates, but then it relieves the body's stress responses. First it increases and then it decreases things like heart rate and blood pressure. And there is a net lowering gain when the laughter stops, which is proportional to the intensity and the duration of the laughter. So if you can all please get together with your dog or your child or your loved one and roll around on the floor laughing like mad and not have a heart attack, at the end of it, you will feel much better for a longer time than if you just laughed a bit when I put my cartoons up. So laughter stimulates all kinds of organs, such as the heart and the lungs and the muscles. Then there's the question of what it does to the brain. Does it stimulate the release of endorphins? You read a lot of claims that this is so, but I am sitting here tonight to tell you that there is no yet reliable experimental result that demonstrates this.
Mm. So you talk about laughter, but in fact earlier on in your talk you said there's not necessarily, humour and doesn't always lead to laughter. So
true.
Where does humour fit, if you like, in this sort of inducing well-being, if you like?
We'll come back to the Duchenne, non-Duchenne. If you're smiling or laughing with real facial response, and tears perhaps even if you're rolling around on the floor in one of those episodes, this is the experience of humour with laughter as a response to it. We can't tell what is the difference between the gain that comes from the physical laughter and the gain which comes from the affective experience.
Okay.
It's a very complex field, and it's fascinating, but I find myself all the time speaking and saying, no, you can't be sure about that. It hasn't been demonstrated yet.
Now, I think there's some more questions just popped up on my screen while I was talking to you. So next question from the audience is, can Americans understand irony?
Some can, some can. Some linguists can't, some I'm thinking of. But no, Americans don't do irony. It's a very British and to some extent Canadian, but not so much because they're moderated their cultural expectations by living next to a great big neighbor. And it's a fascinating question. So cultural historians speculate that maybe this is about a country which has effectively been built to what it is today by wave after wave after wave of really very disparate migration. That the kind of what we do in Australia, we can get away with using irony and deadpan and taking the piss out of people because we don't really care about our migrants. But maybe America has been more virtuous and respectful to its waves of immigrants. The problem with deadpan is, particularly if you're lacking in cultural experience and lacking in familiarity with the new language, it's most upsetting. So I mentioned, I think, in my talk that there are training programs for things like people who work in tourism. When is a good time to use humor and when not? New Zealand has developed one for its immigrants, for its migrant population. It's run by the Victoria University of Wellington, and it's a brilliant idea. I think we should do something the same here. Clown doctors in particular are adamant that unless you're trained, no matter how brilliant a clown you are, unless you're trained as to what to do in a hospital environment, which is partly about not interfering with the medical crises or medical priorities that are there, but it's also about not alarming the children or other patients, being aware that there is a small population, which varies between 5% and 12% of normal population, of people who are gelatophobes, who are worried by the sound of laughter. So, and clowns are scary face, are they not?
Yes, true.
So these things need to be taken into account. So the training programs, the adaptation, the consideration, all has to be gone through. And the same thing with diplomats.
You referred to us as really a nation of piss-taking humorists, if you like, and spoke about the virtual ways of immigration where people have, in fact, adapted to that, appear to have adapted to that approach. Is that still the case? I mean, I'm not quite sure that the current waves of immigration are as aligned or being, influenced to move in that direction. So certainly see, the wogs out of work type. I don't see that sort of humour much anymore.
It's there. If you Google ethnic stand-up, you'll find wave after wave of them. And one of my most prized experiences was to go to the theatre in Newtown for the tour. It was a sold-out tour. Admittedly, this is now 10 more years ago, of Allah Made Me Funny, Muslim stand-up comics.
Okay.
The audience response was unbelievable. And it was exactly how Hung Lee described the response to Wogs Out of Work. There were people from Cabramatta, there were people from Leichhardt, there were people from this suburb and people that come in from the southwest. And they were all sitting in their little groups. And they were bouncing up and down in their seats saying, "What about us? What about us? Tell a joke about us."
Okay.
I hope it's still there. Unfortunately, COVID's sort of killed things off, but
well, I was going
to get back to normal.
Well, I was going to mention, I mean, my computer day after day gets waves and waves of COVID jokes. So, is this a post-pandemic blossoming of different types of humour? Is this a protective strategy we're seeing here, I assume?
I think the interesting thing about joke cycles is that they respond to the topic or need, social need of the moment. So, after Port Arthur, horrible disaster, very, very quickly there were jokes about the Port Arthur massacre. After Princess Di's death, immediately there were jokes about Princess Di's departing this life. What we get at the moment is COVID jokes because that's what we need. It's on our minds. And it's a way of stress relief and stress reduction. Professor Keepers is leading a multinational study collecting anti-COVID jokes around the world. There will be a special issue of the journal. Just hang in there, Elizabeth. You'll be able to read all about it.
Well, maybe I can contribute. I think I have a wealth of them on my computer.
Thank you very much. All source material. Just email me and I'll pass it along.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've come to the end of our questions. So one, I'd like to thank you for answering them so well and so fulsomely, but I really appreciated your talk. It's a field I've known naught about, although obviously heard of jokes and humour, but never realised the great, extent of research and some interesting connections I had never thought of before. So do appreciate your talk, and I do appreciate your answers to your questions, and hope to one day that we will all meet you in the flesh or meet each other in the flesh. There's lots of people. Yes. So thank you very much on behalf of the Royal Society. I thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.